The silliest deaths in history. Sometimes it's your own pride that can get the best of you. This is Hans Steininger, and this is his beard. Hey, my eyes are up here. Looking like the wisest wizard in the world, Hans was a public spectacle in the 16th century and also a well-respected politician. Cause, I mean, come on, who are you gonna vote for? Majestic and marvelous beard boy Hans, or the lame and lackluster clean-shaven Franz? Und that is how I will be lowering taxes while simultaneously providing affordable healthcare and housing for all. Alright, but where's your beard? I don't have one.
This guy stinks!
But behind that big bushel of bristles beats a kind heart, one that legitimately cared for his town and its people. So much so that Hans was elected as mayor for 6 consecutive terms for the town of Braunau am Inn, a town that resides on the border between modern-day Austria and Germany. It's also the birthplace of another famous facial hair haver, albeit far less loved by history, but that's another story. Measuring in at over 4.5 feet in length, Hans's big-ass beard was his defining feature, and was certainly a testament to his patience and care in many aspects in his life. If you can brush your beard, you can untangle legislative issues. If you can oil up your whiskers, you can lubricate the political machine. So it goes without saying that cosmetology and political science are of equal value. At least from a college degree standpoint. However, Hans's biggest asset would be his downfall, quite literally. On September 28, 1567, a fire broke out in the town, which was a much bigger threat back then than it is today. Since the extent of firefighting tactics were just pathetic pails of water, a single small fire could reduce your whole town to cinders real quick. Hans, who usually tucked his beloved beard into a leather pouch for safekeeping and uninhibited travel, let his lusciously long locks whimsically whip in the wind as he ran to help with the fire. Scuttling down some stairs in a panic, Hans had accidentally slammed a piggy right on his own facial pubes, causing him to slip and trip down the entire staircase. He snapped his neck, and the town was devastated. Not by the fire, but by the loss of their beloved mayor. Before being buried, the townsfolk had Hans's beard gently removed and chemically preserved, immortalizing his legacy. The forever facial hair is still on display in a museum in the town today. You know his ghost is pissed, though. Ever have an extreme case of the sleepy ha-has where you find anything and everything to be complete comedic gold to the point of not being able to even breathe? Now try to imagine this soggy scoop of Cheerios doing that. This is Chrysippus, a rather influential Greek Stoic philosopher in the 3rd century BC. In case you don't peruse that corner of YouTube, Stoicism is the philosophy that you only ever need to focus on what you can control in your life. Anything reasonably outside of that control, Hakunas Matatis, not my problemas. Which is a pretty solid philosophy, especially in this age of doom and gloom social media designed to make you perpetually paranoid and pissed off. Chrysippus was also a huge proponent of logical reasoning, having created an original system of propositional logic, stuff like if, then, and or statements that we use to describe the world around us today. For example, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then you're dead to me. Simple logic. The basic idea is that any and all things happen for a reason. Well, I'm sure Chrysippus would have a hard time understanding the logic and reasoning surrounding his rather untimely death. According to legend, Chrysippus, at the fermented old age of 73, got trashed at a feast. In his slizzard state, he had stumbled upon a donkey who was munching on some figs. Registering at least a 6.9 on the ancient Greek comedy scale, the masticating mule was a hilarious sight to behold, prompting Chrysippus to exclaim, quote, "Now give the donkey some pure wine to wash down the figs." This added punchline sent the Lord of Logic over the edge. Chrysippus reportedly hurled himself into a fit of laughter so intense that he had collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Despite some nearby partygoers attempting to help him, he had knocked himself dead with his own joke. But the question is, can you actually die from laughter? Sure you can. It's rare, but medically possible. If you laugh your ass off to the point of it being an uncontrollable fit, that actually puts a lot of stress on your heart. So if you have a weak heart, you're probably going to exacerbate some underlying conditions, leading to a heart attack. You also have the possibility of losing consciousness if you laugh yourself out of breath for long enough. But you have to hear or see something exceptionally funny for that to happen, so don't worry, you're safe here. Now, of course, this recount of events is debated by historians. The guy who documented this particular death was ancient Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived a few hundred years after Chrysippus' death, so he was far from an eyewitness. Diogenes nuts! On top of that, he also wrote an alternative, more mundane account of the comical death, simply writing that Chrysippus died of alcohol poisoning after drinking too much undiluted wine, but I guess he needed to spice some things up for his readers. If there was ever proof that the universe has a cruel sense of humor, then it's the curious case of American lawyer and politician Clement Vallandigham. Howdy. Though he resided in the Union state of Ohio during the mid-1800s, Clement was adamantly against the Civil War, calling it, quote, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. Which is fine, but being a member of the Copperhead faction of the anti-war Democrats, Clement was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer, speaking out against President Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, to which Lincoln was all and sent him to the South to live amongst his Confederate companions in 1863. Clement, who was clearly not about that life, snuck aboard a ship and shipped himself off to Canada before sneaking back to his home state of Ohio to perform rather inconsequential political mumbo-jumbo for the next few years. But after the war was over, Clement attempted to run on political platforms while still advocating for slavery. However, he suddenly switched his views with the Democratic New Departure policy of 1865, which basically 180'd the Democratic Party's stance on slavery once they realized that it fell out of favor in the public's eye. So, being branded as a no-good slavery supporter for life meant the figurative death of his political career. Instead, he turned to a career in law, which would soon lead to his literal death. On June 17, 1871, Vallandigham met his demise while defending his client, Thomas McGeehan, a young fella accused of shooting and killing one Tommy Myers. Clement claimed that Myers had, in fact, not been murdered but accidentally shot himself with his own gun while getting up to stand. Clement vowed that he could demonstrate this before the court, proving McGeehan's innocence. And so he did. Now, when reenacting a scene that results in someone accidentally blowing a hole through their own tummy, you want to make sure that you have safety measures in place that would physically prevent you from doing the same thing. Clement didn't do that. Instead, he had mistakenly used a loaded pistol. While demonstrating the scene as Myers, Clement attempted to draw the seemingly harmless firearm from his coat pocket as he stood up. And he blew a hole through his own tummy, just like Myers. Clement Vallandigham died just 12 hours later from his injuries. The verdict? Not guilty. McGeehan was acquitted and was a free man. Until he was murdered a few years later, that is. You can tempt death all you like, but eventually, he's gonna get what's his. That's what big ol' Bobby Leach found out in 1926. Born in itty-bitty Britain, England in 1858, Leach grew up to be quite the daredevil. Unfortunately, most of Bobby's early life is lost to time, completely shrouded in mystery. We do know that around the 1880s, he had left boring old England for a more exhilarating life in the States. Apparently an excellent swimmer, Leach eventually landed a gig as a professional high diver with the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. There, he performed daringly dangerous feats in front of thousands of eager onlookers. This had quenched the adrenaline-thirsty void in his life for a while, but eventually he retired from this circus life at the age of 50 in order to extend his life expectancy a bit. But that logic was tossed aside rather quickly, as in the early 1900s, Bobby decided to settle down as a humble businessman at Niagara Falls. Blimey, that's a proper waterfall, isn't it? Initially content with just opening up a restaurant, Leach noticed the ever-increasing tourists flocking from afar to see a bunch of water spill over a cliff. So, this gave him an idea. The daredevil was back. Between 1906 and 1911, Leach performed various stunts around the falls, including parachuting from the nearby Honeymoon Bridge to the river below. Over the years, Leach continued to push the envelope, coming up with more and more dangerous stunts to draw larger and larger crowds. Eventually, he faced his biggest challenge, the falls themselves. And on July 25th, 1911, entombed in a customized giant metal barrel, Leach took the plunge. And survived. Sure, he had gashed his forehead, broken his jaw, and all of his kneecaps, but he was still kicking. Bobby Leach became the second person to survive the trip, right behind 63-year-old Annie Taylor. After recovering in the hospital for several months, Leach became a celebrity. Over the next several years, he had plans to make a second bound over the falls, but it never came to be. Why? Well, because in 1926 he went and slipped on a dang orange peel, snapping his leg in half, which went and got infected with gangrene, ultimately killing him a few days later. Remember that death always gets the last laugh. Having served the shortest presidential term in United States history, you know something must have gone down. Well, it was President William Henry Harrison's health bar. The withering president had a pretty impressive career before assuming office. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1791 at the age of 18 and quickly rose through the ranks, serving in the American Indian Wars, which sought to expand U.S. territory further west against native tribes, which they did. Satisfied with his service, Harrison decided to retire from the military at 25 and toss his hat in the ring for a career in politics. Recognized for his leadership skills on the battlefield, then President Guy John Adams gave Harrison control over the territory of Indiana as governor, with the goal of expanding that territory for statehood eligibility. One consequence of this territorial expansion was the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which only further displaced natives from the area in order to allow more settlers to, well, settle. This success cemented Harrison's legacy, as Indiana would eventually become its own state in 1816. But leading military campaigns from afar, that's boring as shit. Harrison missed being in the middle of the action, so he came out from his military retirement to fight in the War of 1812, serving as a major general for the US Army against the smelly redcoats, who weren't too happy seeing the US's throbbing expansion. A bunch of people died, and the war ended in pretty much a stalemate, but the outcome solidified the US as a world power, being able to at least defend itself from a foreign power. This really boosted national morale and pride, and with no restrictions put in place, the US just kept on manifesting that destiny in the coming years. Now back in a time of peace and having successfully satisfied as a war boner, Harrison fell back into politics, serving in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and eventually running for president. His opponent was 8th President Martin Van Buren, whose first term experienced an economic depression with the Panic of 1837. Of course, Van Buren was given the blame for the economic downturn, even though it began over a month before he was even in office. The economy stagnated, unemployment rose, and the people were properly pissed. So it's no surprise that when seeking re-election, it was now Harrison who would be the favorite to win. Aww. Harrison won in a landslide, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60, but that wouldn't matter in about a month. Elected in 1841 at the age of 68, Harrison was getting on in his years. Either a stubborn old goat or a complete idiot, he had the habit of being extremely underprepared for the weather. For example, he delivered his inaugural speech in the bitter cold and rain for 2 hours straight, with no overcoat or weather-appropriate clothes.
Connected with this subject is the character of the currency. The idea of making it exclusively metallic, however well intended, appears to me to be fraught with...
Oh, this is gonna suck. Harrison continued to endure exposure to the elements over the next few weeks, eventually contracting a deadly case of pneumonia. Despite his doctors jacking him to the tits with drugs and relying on good old-fashioned bloodletting, Harrison died on April 4th, 1841, exactly 1 month after being elected. When you were a kid, did you ever try jumping off of a sofa using a blanket as a makeshift parachute, but you failed to calculate if the blanket had the proper coefficient of drag necessary to minimize your acceleration due to gravity, leaving you crashing to the floor in a possible concussion? Just me? Well, take that scenario and scale it up to adult size, except this is your blanket, and this is your couch. Meet Franz Reichelt, the mastermind behind the parachute suit prototype. An Austro-Hungarian tailor and inventor, Franz became hyper-fixated on developing a sort of wearable parachute. He had identified a gap in the market with the rise of humanity's newest invention, the powered aircraft. Seeing reports of pilots forced to launch themselves out of their airborne contraptions if things went south, Franz vowed to come up with a solution to save lives. So we got to work in 1910 with some initial designs, testing the prototypes by strapping them onto makeshift dummies and hucking them off of a 5-story ledge. Surprisingly, the dummies managed to hit the ground at less than fatal speeds. Not bad. But there was a problem. The prototype weighed 150 pounds. And no pilot's gonna lug all that extra weight onto an aircraft, even if it would potentially save their life. But Franz would not give up. After all, you have to fail many times before you succeed. But it did help that there was also some monetary encouragement. Turns out that France's Aeronautic Club held a parachute-esque design competition which offered a cash prize to the tune of 10,000 francs. Considering that the average wage of an unskilled French laborer at the time was only a few francs a day, that prize was nothing to sneeze at. Over the next year, Reichelt was unable to replicate his initial success with any of the lighter redesigns. But to his logic, it wasn't a design problem, it was a height problem. Anyone who has even taken a basic physics course knows that this is a bad idea. You fall exponentially faster the longer you're airborne thanks to acceleration due to gravity. But what's a bunch of stupid science shit gonna do to stop an avid inventor from fulfilling his dream and lining his pockets? Nothing. But the pavement will. But Franz, determined to test his designs from a higher height, pleaded with the Parisian Prefecture of Police to allow him to run an experiment from the Eiffel Tower. Despite numerous rejections, they eventually gave in. On the bitter cold morning of February 4th, 1912, and to the surprise of everyone, Franz arrived on site in his dumpy-looking parachute suit. Now, the police only gave Franz permission to perform this stunt on the grounds that dummies would be used, not that he would be doing the jumping himself. This guy was so confident in his invention, boasting to news journalists of how successful it was gonna be. But apparently the police didn't feel like stopping him, so after a bunch of preparations, Reichelt made the leap, but his parachute suit failed to properly deploy, so the poor fella plummeted 187 feet to his death, achieving nothing but a Franz-shaped dent in the cement. And so ends another silly video. I'm going to be making a part 2 to this sometime soon, so subscribe to see that in the near future. In the meantime, I think you're going to like this video here. Go watch it. I'll see you over there.